Hi folks, can you all please put your hands together for writer-director Adam Elliot.
Thank you. I brought a little friend. I'll just pop her down here. Just fix her eyeballs. Here she is. Just her head.
How'd you all like the film? Well, thank you for being with us today, Adam. We really appreciate it. We've got plenty of time. We've got 40 minutes. We're going to open this up to the audience as well at some point, so you guys can all ask your questions. But we've got a few ourselves that we've been dying to ask you. First one to kick it off is, there's 15 years between Memoir of a Snail and Mary and Max, which I don't know how many of you have seen Mary and Max, but another incredible film to go check out if you haven't seen it yet. What happens for you in those 15 years, and what leads you to this story?
Wow. It wasn't meant to be 15 years. It was meant to be 3. Look, life just kept getting in the way. COVID, well, there's 3 years there. For me to write, it takes a long time for me to find something to write about. And weirdly, I can't write until I'm angry about something. And usually it's a sense of injustice about something. So after Mary and Max, it took a year to recover. My producer and I separated, so it was this sort of creative divorce, and so we had to recover from that. What else? My dad died. All these things just kept getting in the way, and but eventually I found something to get angry about. Actually, it was the death of my father. He was a bit of a hoarder, and when he died, he left behind 3 sheds full of stuff. And so my siblings and I had to go through all that, and we got very annoyed with him, very frustrated. But that annoyance then led to curiosity and fascination about why, as human beings, do we collect things and fill up our homes with things we don't need. So that sort of kicked it off. I'm a slow writer, so it took 3 years to write it. It took 3 years to finance it, to raise the $7 million to make this. And then COVID struck, so that slowed us down. So there was just all these things. And then it took 18 months to make it. We only did 5 seconds of animation per day, so it took 32 weeks just to animate it. Then we had to make everything. That took 4 months. And then post-production, editing, all the music had to be composed and recorded. That took another 6 months. So, 15 years just flew by.
And for context with that too, $7 million for this film, putting it into perspective, a film like Inside Out 2 that came out the same year, $200 million to make.
Yes. Well, look, my films are obviously boutique or art house or independent, whatever you want to call it. So my audiences are smaller. Certainly my films aren't for little kids, they're for mature teenagers up. And it means that the budgets have always had to be at the lower end. But $7 million, of course, is still a lot of money. When I say it's your money, by the way, every dollar, well, not every dollar, nearly every dollar I've earned over the last 30 years that has gone into my films has come from Screen Australia, Film Victoria. So I'm a government-funded artist, and so I always thank you, my investors, for giving you your tax to the government, and they give it back to me.
I'm curious to know, so you mentioned it took a while to actually get the film off the ground, the writing process, making the film. Were you considering cast to play those roles while you were writing the film? Did you picture a particular voice to bring these characters to life?
Yeah, for this film, it's weird. When I'm writing, I don't imagine the characters as clay. To me, they're real people, so I imagine real actors. And certainly certain voices pop into your head, and there is a lot of pressure to have big names, so at one point I thought, oh, Nicole Kidman or Margot Robbie, but then Sarah's voice popped into my head because I just rewatched one of her first Australian films, These Final Hours, about the end of the world. And actually my producer, Liz, she'd produced that many years ago. And I thought, oh, there's something about Sarah's voice that I really like. You know, there's this sort of shyness. She has sort of, her Australian accent's not too thick. And she has this sort of vulnerability in there as well. And so I started to rewatch all her films, and then of course watched Succession, and a lot of it I watched with my eyes shut, and I would just be listening to her voice. And it takes a long time for me to decide if that actor's going to be right, because in animation there's always a risk that when you combine a voice with a blob of clay, that sometimes they don't marry. And a good example is the film Paddington, which originally was going to be voiced by Colin Firth, but it just didn't work, and they ended up getting Ben Whishaw. And so there's always this risk. You get this big name actor and then it doesn't work and you have to tell them sorry, and they don't give the money back.
Has that ever happened to you?
Not yet, no, I've been very lucky. So Sarah was, certainly our first choice, and we got her. And Jackie Weaver, you know, that was a no-brainer really. We just thought it had to be Jackie. And Cody, he just felt right as well, age appropriate. He sort of is a very brooding person. There's a lot of darkness to him, so we thought that would have a good simpatico. And so I certainly look for actors who have just qualities about, you know, the weird thing is I don't ever get my actors to act. I'm actually more interested in their natural speaking voices. I don't want them to put on cartoonish voices. I want them to be real, believable, authentic. So then when you're watching the film, it feels very true. So when Sarah came in, actually, she said, oh, what sort of voice? I said, no, I'm just after your voice. I just want you. And the way we recorded her was we brought in one of the Sylvia the Snail puppets, and we put it on the little table in the sound recording studio. And I said, and we had 5 sessions with her, and I said, I just want you to talk to the snail for an hour and a half, just talk to the snail. And she did, and within minutes they were having this conversation, a one-way conversation, but that's how we got that real sincerity and authenticity. So to answer your question, yes, Sarah was the first choice.
That's brilliant. I have to ask about my favourite cameo in the film too, which is Nick Cave, who, for anyone who doesn't know, is the postman who gets eaten by the crocodile and reads that brilliant poem. Was that always in your mind when you wrote that poem? Did that just come later?
That one was later, yeah. Supporting cast, usually we choose while we're shooting the film. When the characters start to come alive, we think, oh, who could possibly do that voice? And there's always a cameo. In the past I've had Kamal and Molly Meldrum, and we always look for somebody who's not necessarily an actor. And we thought, what about a musician? And we thought of Paul Kelly and Jimmy Barnes, and I said, actually no, I think Nick Cave would be perfect because he has to read this poem, and Nick Cave, calls himself a poet. And so I wrote this poem, and I thought, wouldn't it be great when Nick Cave has just got that voice, Never thinking he'd say yes because he lives in London, but we ended up getting a studio there, and our studio here, we got a hookup so we could, we got Zoom as well so I could see him. So we recorded him remotely. And he was great. He really, he'd never done something like this, and I think we did 42 takes, which were pretty much all the same. And then he also said, what sort of voice do you want me to do? And I said, no, I just want you to be Nick Cave. Just be yourself. And then he said, how Nick Cave do you want me to be? I said, I'm 10% more. So he did, and he really laid it on thick. And, I think we used the first take, Yeah, he was great.
I had a question about your inspiration for the film and your references. Were there any films or pieces of art that inspired you when making this film, specifically maybe with the framing of certain shots?
Yeah, look, I'm certainly a big cinephile, and to be honest, I don't watch a lot of animation. I much prefer live action films and documentaries and your films. I'm really interested in narrative and stories that are very bittersweet, comic, tragic. And so I love films that explore darkness, but certainly have a lighter side as well. So, I mean, this film, there's bits of memoir, My Life as a Dog, Memoirs of a Geisha, it's sort of a mashup of a whole lot of influences. I always cite Barry Humphries as one of my favourite influences because particularly his characters, Sandy Stone, who get on stage and do these wonderful monologues, and they were very funny but also very tragic at the same time. And also the late Michael Looney, cartoonist, his cartoons are very philosophical, poetic, again comic but also tragic. So I love that duality, and it doesn't really often happen in animation. Animation tends to be light and fluffy and more entertaining, but I've always admired animation from countries like Estonia and the Czech Republic, who aren't afraid of going into risky subject matter. I mean, obviously in this film, we have a gay conversion sequence. Eric Bana masturbating in a courtroom. There's a lot of confronting, challenging subject matter. And I think as a writer and a director, it's our job to push the boundaries. And I'm always looking for films that are fresh and original and not offensive, but just, pushing the envelope a bit.
That's fascinating to me. So you mentioned just then you like to watch a lot of live action. I might be just making things up here, but I recently picked up a Blu-ray of all of Martin Scorsese's short films. And I wondered, I noticed in the narrative and the voiceover in his shorts and just his films in general, there's quite a comedic sense, actually the same way that in the narrative of the voiceover in this. Are you at all inspired by his films?
Sure. Actually, I just watched an old Scorsese a few nights ago, After Hours. So, yeah, look, I everyone from Kubrick, of course, as a filmmaker, we all have to bow down to Stanley Kubrick and Scorsese, but then, lesser known filmmakers. As I mentioned, there's a lot of auteur filmmakers in Estonia who I love. My favourite animator is a guy called Jan Schwankmajer, who animates rotting meat and animal bones, and his films are surrealist, so there's not really any plots in there. So all sorts of inspirations, and I really read a lot too. So everything from, I was rereading David Copperfield recently to Confederacy of Dunces. It's one of my favourite books. I'm certainly drawn to fiction, but I do love non-fiction, and I love documentaries, biographies for sure. I love biopics, any films that really have a single protagonist and explore that characters from birth to death. So that's why I call my films clayographies, which is a pretentious word I invented myself, which is a blend of clay biographies. And pretty much that's what all 7 of my films are. They all sort of follow one lead character, protagonist through their life. And Mary and Max is sort of the two characters there, but Memoir is certainly more about Grace than it is Gilbert.
Yeah, it's almost like in a way, because I noticed that in your films, how your passage of time is much more extended than we're used to seeing in films. You can just have a title card suddenly 5 years later, and that's okay, we're still on the ride with you. And I think that, coupled with the fact that you are literally recreating everything in a miniature, almost has some way of allowing you as an audience to stand back and see the really profound, small details and important things in life because of that.
Oh, for sure. Look, I love idiosyncrasies. I love the minutiae and I certainly love quirky characters, and I love eccentricity. And weirdly, the way I write is sort of back to front. I always start with a detail and worry about a plot later. So I go through my journals and notebooks that go back 3 decades, and I'll flick through them and I think, oh yes, character with a leaf blower, must have that in the film. What else? Guinea pigs mating, I'll put that in the film. So I find all the things that amuse me or move me, you know, the poignant things as well. And then the trick is trying to get them to all string together and then get a balance between the light and the dark and the comedy and the tragedy. So, yeah, they're very dense films, and they certainly need second and third viewings to really see particularly all the visual gags that are happening in the background. And this film too, it's about a hoarder, so it's overwhelming. I mean, that opening shot where the camera goes through all it's really meant to tell you that you're about to see something that's going to exhaust you visually and emotionally. And I always say, if you're not an emotional wreck by the end of the film, then I've failed as a filmmaker.
So you were born in Berwick, and you grew up on a prawn farm in South Australia, and then you moved to Mount Waverley. All of these places are very, very far from the world of filmmaking, and I can certainly relate to that. Growing up in Berwick myself, I guess that world just seemed so far away. I didn't even know where to begin. Was it always claymation for you?
No, I actually wanted to be a vet. Yeah, look, my father, to cut a long story short, was a retired acrobatic clown, and he and my Uncle Barry were a duo called the Flying Trapinos, and they were regulars on Graham Kennedy's in Melbourne Tonight. So I had this very interesting childhood, but then Dad did his back in, and as you naturally do when you retire from acrobatic clowning, you go into prawn farming. So we moved to this little town in the outback of South Australia called Port Broughton, and with my uncle Jim Rakavolis, who ran the fish markets here in Melbourne, we raised prawns, and it didn't go very well, to cut a long story short. And so we moved back to Melbourne, Mount Waverley. Dad then went into hardware stores, so we had Elliot's Hardware, and then he went into storage facilities. So like I've just had all these experiences, chapters in my life, and it's certainly been interesting. And growing up too, I thought this was all normal, and then you realise it's not that normal. But yeah, look, I think they've all been valuable. You know, being brought up in Narre Warren before we went to South Australia, we're next to the Montague apple orchards, which is why there's apples in this film. So, you know, all these experiences are all fodder and all become ingredients. And that's why I keep detailed notebooks, because as I'm getting older, I'm forgetting things. So I use these. I call my films cakes, and my journals are the recipe books, and that's where I get my ingredients.
How did you find filmmaking? Like, what was that? Because you said you wanted to be a vet. So how did you go from that? Well,
I went to, Mum and Dad sent me to Haileybury College in Keysborough, and I had two great art teachers. I had a drama teacher, Stuart Bell, and an art teacher, Graham Bennett. And Graham, my art teacher, one day brought in this, we thought it was a Logie, but it was an Academy Award that he had won for set design on the Richard Harris film Camelot. So we didn't know what this Oscar was, and I remember looking at that thinking, oh wow, I said, you were in the film industry, and before he retired and became an art teacher out in Keysborough, you know. So I was very lucky at Haileybury to have these great teachers, and I knew I was going to do something in the arts. But when I finished and did my year 12, I was exhausted, and I really didn't know what I exactly wanted to do. So I moved back home to Mum and Dad, who were building another house here in Narre Warren, and I just spent a year playing around with drawing and sculpting, and I ended up down opposite Haileybury Berwick. There was, I don't know if it's still there, there was a market every Sunday. Still there, right. Oh, so I got a little stall there. This is a long story. I got a stall there, and my uncle, who's dead now, he said, why don't you, because I was always drawing, he said, why don't you draw some cartoons on cards and sell those down at the craft market? So I did. I had a little stall there, and I was selling these little cartoons on cards, and that was okay. And then someone said, why don't you get a stall at the St Kilda Esplanade Craft Market? That's the mega, that's the ultimate craft market. So I did. I got a stall down there, and every Sunday I drive all the way to St Kilda, and I sold my little cards, but then I switched to T-shirts. So to cut a long story short, I sold T-shirts for 5 years, and my most popular design was Murray the tap dancing dim sim. And I would hand paint these T-shirts. I put them in pizza boxes with the lid cut out, and I sold thousands of these T-shirts. But then I was about 25, and all my friends who went to Haileybury were all becoming doctors and lawyers, and come and visit me at the craft market and pat me on the head, and patronise me. And the woman next to me, she sold ties, and she had enough, and she said, I'm going to film school, I'm going to become a filmmaker. So she did. Off she went to the College of the Arts, and she then said, and I loved acting as well. And she said, do you want to be an actor in my film? And I said, sure. So I was an actor in her short film. And I got to go to the College of the Arts and see this wonderful film school. And at that point I thought, well, I'm sick of T-shirts. And I thought, well, maybe I could do the animation course. I draw all these cartoons. Maybe if they started moving, that could lead to something else. So I applied for the course, and you had to go in and have an interview. And I took in all my T-shirts, and the lecturer at the time, Sarah Watt, who's sadly no longer with us, but she was the lecturer there, and she looked at my T-shirts and she said, well, you haven't got any evidence of anything that moves. We really need you to have done some sort of demonstration that you want to be an animator. So to cut a long story short, I didn't get in, and at the same time I saw a course advertised at the Council for Adult Education in Flinders Street, which is still there, and it was for a picture frame making course. And I love photography, and I thought, well, maybe I could learn how to frame my own photographs and sell those down at the craft market, because I'm sick of T-shirts. So I got into the picture frame making course, but no, I didn't get into film school. And on the first evening, as I got ready to head into the Council for Adult Education, the phone rang, and it was Carol Gregory, the school administrator at the VCA. She said, Adam, I'm just ringing to let you know that even though your interview, you weren't successful, we liked your T-shirts, and one of the 8 successful applicants has decided to drop out, and we have a waiting list, and you're on the top of the waiting list. We think you have potential. Do you want to become an animator? And I said, oh, that's fantastic. But look, I've just enrolled in this picture frame. I'm not sure I'll get my $50 deposit back. But to cut a long story short, that she twisted my arm and off I went to film school, and it was just a 1-year postgraduate diploma in animation. And even then I was still going to do 2D animation. I hadn't touched plasticine since I was a little kid. But we all had to make a student film, and back then we were still shooting on 16mm celluloid. And one of my 8 uncles had just died. Weirdly, the one who told me to get the stall down here at Berwick. And so I made a film about him called Uncle, and that was my first clay-mated film. And it won an AFI award, and then it did really well at film festivals. And so I got the bug, and I realised then too that animation was a culmination of all the things I loved. I loved photography, I loved watching films, I loved storytelling. I love comedies, tragedies. I love editing. It just was all these things I loved all rolled into one. So I was 25, and I feel like I was a bit of a late bloomer. But looking back, 25 is so young, and I'd been backpacking around the world. I'd done all these other things. So I had all this life experience, which is what you need when you go to film school. So that's where it all started, and that's pretty much all I've been doing for 30 years is I just make one film at a time. I don't do ads, I don't do any commercial work, I just write, direct. I have 3 things on my computer screen: read, write, draw, repeat. Read, write, draw. And that's all I do. I'm actually quite a boring person. So I've been very lucky over the years. And again, the government have supported me right through. And it's taken me a long time to say this word, but I'm certainly an auteur, which is a pretentious French word for writer-director. But I think I'm comfortable finally calling myself that. That was a very long answer.
That's great. I think we should open it up to some questions. We've got a roving mic here, so if you just put your hands up. Yeah, there's one just there. There's the lady in the middle there.
Up here? Oh, good.
Just kidding.
Hi. So I was really curious to know about like your creative process when making environments. Obviously, especially in Memoir, there's so many really wonderful environments in there, like Pinky's house, Gracie's room, and all of that. So is there like a mood board? Do you do like do's and don'ts when you sort of build these environments, and anything made you sort of learned over your years working on these movies?
Sure. Well, we in the studio, when we're making the films, on all the walls we have two words: chunky, wonky, and that's the aesthetic that we're after. And nothing has to be I don't want anything to look super refined and polished. Everything has to look like you've bought it in a second-hand store or an op shop. And a lot of the artists we employed have come from productions where they're used to making things that look perfect. And I said, no, I don't want perfect, I want imperfect. So often they'd finish something and I'd drop it on the ground deliberately so they'd have a few bumps and lumps in it. Because we want the films to look like they're handmade, and they are handmade. Every single thing you just saw was handcrafted. There's not one single frame of computer-generated imagery. There's no AI for sure. Even the fire was yellow cellophane, the cigarette smoke was cotton wool. All the tears in the film, all the liquid, all the water is sexual lubricant. Litres and litres and litres. Our poor runner was always going to Chemist Warehouse to find it all up. So everything is real, and that's deliberate. We could take shortcuts and do the fire with CGI, but we want to do things in a very traditional way. So in terms of the production design and the aesthetic, we want it to look rough around the edges, and even the fingerprints on the clay we leave in to remind the audience that what they're looking at is handmade. I do all the production design myself, and I did all that during COVID actually. That was another thing I do, and I just draw on A4 paper just with a pencil, grey lead pencil, and I don't do any colour. And so every character goes through many iterations. So Grace had probably over 100 different designs before I settled on what I thought would work. I love production design. I think as an auteur too, and you guys would know this, you wear many hats, you have to do many roles, and I think as an animator too, you tend to become a megalomaniac and a control freak, and I think it's because you get to play God, and I think that's the beauty of animation, is that we have total creative control and freedom over how our characters look and our environments. So yeah, they're very detailed. There's a lot of design work goes in, but luckily I have a wonderful team of artists who I didn't make any of this, they built all this, I didn't make Grace. So there's one person, for example, who just did hair, sat there for months gluing in each bit of hair. They're now insane. Yeah.
Any more questions? Yeah, well, there's one right there.
G'day. So I watched Mary and Max for the first time this morning, so I just wanted to say how dare you for that ending, first of all. But I really like both of your feature films. They have the real darkness, but also the real hope about life in general. Is that kind of like the main idea you start with, or does that just kind of come about through your writing process, I guess?
Yeah, look, I love that quote, without the dark, the light has no meaning. So I think for you to truly appreciate a happy ending, you have to have gone to a darker place, particularly with comedy. Comedy's often, laughing is the release of tension. So I really am quite cruel to Grace, and I really inflict a lot of trauma upon her. Similarly for Mary and Max, I really quite torturous to those characters. But I think the endings are far more impactful and fulfilling and satisfying and uplifting when the story has been a zigzag of, a roller coaster, which is why I love roller coasters, is that high and low emotion. You're really pushing every button on the audience. Again, I want you to be exhausted by the end. But I also want the films to linger. I want them to be films that you go back to when you're feeling a bit down. A lot of people call my films medicine. So they can go and watch them when they're feeling a bit, down about the world. Because even though they're dark, I don't want them to be depressing. I really want them to be uplifting. So when you leave the cinema, you actually are buoyant, and you may have shed a few tears, but they're tears of joy. And really what I'm trying to do is get humanity into all the films, is to create characters that are archetypal, not stereotypical archetypes. Grace is an archetypal underdog. Same with Max. These are all people who are not heroic, although they are, I think, quite courageous, but they're just ordinary people, and they're the stories I'm interested in. I'm not interested in superheroes or talking animals. These, even though they're blobs of clay, I want you to believe that they have a soul and a heartbeat. And it's all about, the suspension of disbelief. When you go and see any film, you have to, for an hour and a half, let go, and that these are actors, this is all fake. We're pretty much all just staring at a brick wall for an hour and a half, really. And that's the magic of cinema, and that's why storytelling is still so important and powerful. And why feature films, even though we have all these other distractions like, video games and YouTube and all these things, people still watch feature films because that hour and a half, that 3-act structure, that beginning, middle and end, I love that quote, storytelling or stories are equipment for living. And we all have our favourite films that we go to as nourishment and that we go to remind us that we're not the only ones having a bad day. I certainly have my collection of, it's like songs, you always play your favourite songs that when you're feeling a bit blue, you go and listen to. So.
What's your film that you go to when you feel blue?
The Elephant Man, which doesn't sound like an uplifting film, but I saw that when I was way too young. I thought it was about an elephant. But yeah, that's a film that still really resonates for me, more for sentimental reasons,
All right, I think we had another one. We've got one way up the back, and then we'll get to the front here.
Look, given your choice of medium, I find it fairly ironic that movie would have worked perfectly as an audio play.
Yes, yeah.
And so I'm wondering, is that a byproduct of your production process, or do you put that, when does that come into your development process?
Well, look, I love narration and voiceover for two reasons. It's cheaper, so getting the actor to say the character walked into the room instead of actually doing it. I mean, in that film, there's no actual real walking. All the characters are done with the Muppet technique, where they just bob on like that. So, there might be wide shot of the characters just standing there, but you never really actually see their feet and legs move. So because the budgets are low, we have to be very economical and avoid walking and actual talking, which is why there's so much narration. Too much narration can be a problem. It's just getting that balance. And there's that rule, show it, don't say it. So we always try and apply that. We're always trying to pare the dialogue back. But yeah, I love that the sort of films too that if you're really tired, you can just shut your eyes and you can really get the gist of what's happening. Also too, I love music, so I really want the music to sort of balance the voice at the same time. All the music in this film was composed from scratch by a Sydney composer, Elena Katzachin, and actually we've just been doing some live version in Sydney. We just did 5 concerts with the Australian Chamber Orchestra playing live with the film, and we're about to tour that around the world as well, because the music I think is really I think drives the film in many ways. It's so nourishing and uplifting, and it would be a very different film without the music. I love films like The Piano and Even E.T., you look, imagine the film E.T. without the John Williams' amazing score, it just wouldn't work. So I'm always trying to remind the audience how important the sound is as well.
I think we had questions down the front here. Maybe we could pass the microphone down.
Right.
Thanks very much. Firstly, thank you. That was such a lovely film with so much heart. Actually, I haven't seen something as nice as that for a long, long time. So I know you said it's dark, but I got a lot out of that. My question isn't very highbrow. I noticed that you referenced Dennis Denuto, accountants, in the film, and there's a lot of highbrow films to reference, but The Castle, is that one of your favourites?
The Castle's absolutely in my top 10. I love The Castle. I just think, and sadly we don't get enough of those sorts of Australian films anymore. We, used to be every 5 years a Priscilla would come out or a Muriel's Wedding, but it's been a bit dry for a while, and that's, thank God there's emerging filmmakers like merged.
We're working on it.
Because we're drowning in American and European content, and we really need quotas to really get more Australian content. There's lots of fantastic Australian dramas, but Australian features are a bit lacking. We've made some great stuff. And the rest of the world, and I've just come back from this tour with Memoir of a Snail, and audiences overseas are hungry for Australian content. They really are, and they know films like Romper Stomper, and they've seen our stuff. They want to see more of it, and it's just a shame that, it doesn't help too that I'm just as bad as everyone else. Getting off the couch, stop watching Netflix, go to the actual cinema, and so I try at least once every 2 weeks to go to the actual cinema and try and see an Australian film. And of course, the Melbourne Film Festival's coming up, which is another great place to see Australian content. But yeah, it's tough, but you've got to block all that out and it all comes down to a good story well told. And I've read all the books on how to write a good screenplay, and I right back to Aristotle, and it does come down to a very simple sort of premise: is that we're all humans, we all experience highs and lows, and we all love a good story, and we need more stories, particularly now in such a tumultuous time around the world. I've forgotten the question, but anyway.
I think there was another one. All right, we've got one right there. We can go back.
So this is the first time I've seen the movie, and I've been bawling my eyes out for the past 20 minutes. But I just wanted to ask about the distribution of this film, because as far as I know, like across the road, they weren't playing this film instead of here. And I just wanted to know what kind of problems you have in terms of distribution, or is it just that you love having at a moment doing a Q&A in your movie and then doing a Q&A?
Well, look, it's tough in Australia. I think only 2 or 3% of the films that people go and see at the cinema are Australian. The rest are American, usually. But we just had 2 million people go and see the film in Mexico at the cinema. So, I love Australia, I love making films for us, but really I have to be realistic and make them for the rest of the world. So the films, Mary Max and Memoir, are just about to get re-released in China, and so that that's a big market. So you have to. It's a weird balance. You have to try and make an Australian film that celebrates our culture, but it also has to be universal and accessible enough that people of course no one knows what a Chico roll is in China, but they get the gist, and that's why Grace, I made her very universal and that she can be relatable. But yeah, it is tough. I think we opened to 150 cinemas here in Australia. The ones that did the best were the ones in the city, so Sydney, in Melbourne, the Nova. I think we were there for 17 weeks at the Nova. So we are an art house film, so it tends to be the more independent cinemas. We did okay at the Hoyts and for a week or two, but again, there's so much other competition now. Back in the 70s, there was nothing else to do. So go to the cinema, really. I think Mexico, Japan, we've released in nearly every country. we're big in Argentina. I don't know why.
Another question. Got one right down here.
There's some more up the back as well.
Oh.
Sorry, I couldn't see that.
We'll go at the back in a second.
Thank you. I just want to say that that was my first time seeing your film or hearing about your work. I just got dragged along by my friend here, Kai. But I just want to say, by the end of it, I was a sobbing mess, and I would have thought I would. Anyway, my question is, when I watch it for the second time, is there anything that I would have to, that you would like me to kind of watch out for, or is there anything like hidden, anything cheeky?
Oh yes, there is actually. Yeah. Oh yeah, I'm glad you reminded me. It's a bit of a story, but one of the animators was my cousin Donna, and we called her Cyclone Donna because she was always accidentally cutting herself, or one day she was trimming some balsa wood and she stabbed the person next to her. So she was always. Anyway, one day she was making a little prop and she accidentally cut off the top of her finger, and it was a nasty cut and it fell on the ground. Of course, we quickly wrapped her up and sent her off to the doctors, and luckily she didn't need stitches, but we couldn't find the tip of her finger anywhere. So we just thought stuck to somebody's shoe or whatever. And then about 3 or 4 days later, someone yelled out, "I found it!" And they picked it up and there was this dried up fingertip. And we thought, well, what are we going to do with this? And we have a glass blower who made all the little glasses, actually out in Dandenong he is, and he made all the glassware. And we had a spare little jar with a little tiny cork, so we put the fingertip in there and it appears throughout the film. So just keep it on Grace's shelves. It's in the opening montage. So yeah, there's a little bit of DNA.
We are unfortunately out of time, but I kind of wanted to end on this, Adam. So I've heard there's a rumour going around the grapevine. When you won the Academy Award in 2004 for Best Animated Short for Harvey Croppett, you returned home to Australia. You had 2 letters in the mail, one from the then Prime Minister at the time, John Howard, congratulating you on your win, and the other from Centrelink, informing you that they had cancelled your payments.
Yes, it was a bit of a letdown. Yeah, well, actually, we got back from LA, and I remember getting off out at Tullamarine, and there was all the press and the paparazzi, and they followed us back to my house. I was living in St Kilda at the time, and my dad was out the front of the house, of the apartment, to say, "You won't believe who's in the lounge room when you go upstairs." I said, so I went up the stairs and walked in, and there was Steve Brax, the Premier, with a bottle of champagne and Channel 9 and all the stations are there, and it's all overwhelming, and there were a big pile of letters and cards from long-lost primary school teachers and relatives I didn't know I had. So after all this circus, when I sat down and I just started to open up these wonderful, very kind letters and cards, and very patriotic, a lot of sort of, it was like we were the only Australians at the Olympics that year. And there was one very official one. I opened it up and it was from John Howard and said, "On behalf of Australia, you've made us very proud." I thought, oh my God, I didn't even vote for him. And then the next one was from Centrelink, and I thought, even Centrelink have sent me a congratulations. "Dear Mr. Elliot, you've been cut off the dole," because the day we won the Oscar, I was meant to put in my dole form, my diary, and I was meant to go to a seminar too, which was what to wear to a job interview and how to write a resume. And then weirdly, about a month later, we were flown up to meet the Prime Minister in his office, and so we went in and I told him the story that, thank God for Centrelink. It kept me buoyant. But I tell that story too because it is important that, in between some of my short films in the early days, it was really tough, and I'd often, go and work in my dad's hardware shop or find bits and pieces to do. But there were times where I couldn't get work, and I'd have to go on the dole, and I'd call it temporary government funding until I got some money from the government. But I've paid it all back, and my films, now that they make profits, that money goes back to the government. That doesn't go to me, it goes back to the government, and it goes into supporting emerging filmmakers. So it's really good that we have this system. We're so lucky in Australia that the government supports the arts, and in America it's getting worse and worse. There's no Screen Australia in America. There's no sort of government funding. You have to go to a big studio, and so you're obliged to make films their way. But here we get to make films our way, and that's why our films, when we do make them, do well, because they're uncompromised. They're not pandering to a studio. They don't have to have a happy ending the way the studio wants it. So we're really lucky. We follow the sort of European, the French model, which is great. So again, we're very appreciative that you help support us. So thank you.
Before we do leave today, I just wanted to give a quick plug to the Multicultural Film Festival screening event taking place in this studio on Saturday, 26th of July. That was it.
And I want to thank all of you for coming out on Sunday and watching this film, and thank you, Adam, for joining us and giving us some incredible insight into the making of the film.
Thank you, Zane. Thank you, guys. And thank you for